I always feel that production design is really responsible for filling in, almost filling in the backstory around the film itself. That you're creating a world that the actors and the script itself inhabits, so that you're really kind of filling in all the blank spaces and joining up the dots of the whole sort of narrative structure of the film. It's a very interesting script because it was partly because it was a comedy, and I hadn't worked on I think the last major comedy that I designed was Shameless. I designed the very first series of Shameless, and I've always really I really enjoyed working on comedies. They allow you to be to exercise a bit of wit in the the look and style and feel of the film, and the script was lovely, very kind of funny but warm. Interesting kind of script, and it was about set in Leicester, which is a place that is one of those places that everybody goes through and never stops and looks at, and it was just interesting seeing it because it, in a lot of ways, it was very much told a big kind of story about recent contemporary British social history, and it was an interesting place, but in a very surprising way. My favourite scene of all of them was, in fact, the kind of almost catastrophic reconciliation of the brothers in the hospital, and it was really interesting. I think it's a lovely scene because it's both tragic and comic and very moving at the same time, and just that wonderful moment when they both realise that they've just been so sort of pig-headed and stupid, but neither of them could quite bring themselves to admit it. And just before Christmas we went and spent basically a couple of weeks looking at Leicester generally. Amit knew the area incredibly well, having been brought up there, and there were certain sort of areas that he knew were central, key visually to the look of the film. But then as we started to refine it, we found that there was certain locations, or what we'd found was that there were certain visual references, like the reality of the houses that the Asian families, aspiring Asian families, had found, and there was something quite unexpected and interesting and strange about them that we sort of then had to kind of incorporate into the look and style of the film. I've designed 2 films in India, and I spent a fair bit of time painting there, and I kind of watched India in the last sort of 5–10 years. It really has changed an enormous amount, and the strange thing about Leicester is that it's almost a vision of India that has largely disappeared from India. It's almost like a retro version of Mumbai or Delhi. Well, they've been really fantastic. I mean, everybody just really went out their way to help us. I mean, we did, a lot of people were extremely generous with a lot of the locations that we used, and certain people that hired us specific props, and it was really very good, very unusual. I mean, I found the people in Leicester absolutely lovely, really very warm and generous. It's very interesting. What we've tried to do is try to actually avoid, if wherever possible, avoid any kind of cliches about the whole sort of look and feel of Asian, British Asian life, and it meant that we had to be very kind of almost ruthlessly honest about what we found, what we saw, and as I mentioned about some of the locations that we found, the interiors, the reality of what we saw was very unexpected, much more minimal and pared down, and so we had to, with some of our locations, we kind of reflected this. For instance, Vinod's flat was this very, very minimal, very, very sort of extravagant kind of space, I suppose, with very expensive taste. Well, the overall palette, what we tried to do was not to go completely overboard with the colour, but to really build it to a climax in the Kings of Curry competition. So that up until that point, with a few exceptions, that everything was very muted and not completely over the top. I mean, and a really big contrast between, for instance, Shalini's London flat. Everything there, we deliberately kept everything very cool and muted, and then started slowly introducing colour to the final, to the competition, where it really pushed to its extreme. Well, the studio was very interesting because what we discovered, that we were very much locked into the realities of the two locations that we found for the brothers' restaurants, that it was very important that they had to be a physical connection between the two to make that whole sense of the two brothers having stared at each other for 20 years across the road. And that it was just impossible to find two interiors on location that worked for the two restaurant interiors. But what we did find was a wonderful, for the Shalina's restaurant on the first floor, and we then disguised the Amit's mother's restaurant front and the restaurant next door to her, and combined them, made it look as though it was a double-fronted restaurant. That in the film we then built the interior in the studio, which was wonderful because it gave us an enormous amount of flexibility in terms of then playing with the space. But what we then also did was then used the one kitchen in the Shalina's restaurant, and we redressed it and repainted it for the brothers' kitchen, because the idea Mitt wanted was that very much that the two brothers had almost kind of copied each other. That there was a similarity all the way through, right the way down to the ripped up recipe book. That really these two brothers were really in reality very, very close and shared a lot of common taste, and also, well, with the food as well. What we started with was basically we knew that the given in terms of dimension was the two exteriors of Mrs. Gupta's restaurant and the restaurant next door. And that gave us a basic kind of size of a double-fronted restaurant. And I then basically used the same, kept the height of the building, height of the ceilings and the overall kind of depth of it pretty similar. It worked out very well for we had a warehouse studio space that was just about the right size. What it didn't give us was the backing, really enough depth for the backing, and we considered putting a translight outside, but then we had introduced a kind of perforated screen, wooden screen, to disguise the interior for our shots outside. And we realised that there was very little, you couldn't see that much through it, and Roger lit it in such a way that he basically burnt out the view outside. And when you see the film, you'll see it doesn't really, you're never really that conscious of it because the screen is so dense and intricate. So having got that as a basic size and dimensions, I then talked through with Amit about how he wanted the various actions to work. There was one key area was just the relationship of the kitchen to the rest of the restaurant, and the movement from the kitchen through into the restaurant, and the way in which the waiters and the brothers actually moved from there. Also where we actually placed people within the restaurant to make it work, because it's a very, I think for most directors, you know, shooting people around a dinner table is one of the hardest things to make work, and there was a lot of that here, so it was very important that we actually used, you know, created a space that would be as flexible and as interesting as possible for the camera crew. We actually drew it up. I did the initial designs, did some visual sketches. We built a model to begin with that I showed to Amit and to Roger, and we talked about how it was going to be lit, where he particularly want to float walls and make, you know, the space work on a technical level. Then Antoine, my construction manager, then started breaking down the drawings and started working, building the basic kind of flattage. And we had to use the space that we were using as the studio was also a construction workshop. So it was very much a process of actually building the flattage and then standing it up. And then for a while there was this strange kind of mixture of a construction workshop going on and a set going up around it and containing it. So it then got to the point where we then had to sort of move the construction space outside, and then the painters then moved in and started painting. We found a fabulous strange shop that had bin end of wallpapers, but in rather wonderful exuberant patterns, shall I say. It was a part of a chain that I'd used before. I'd used on Bronson, and they're really, really interesting firm. So we used a lot of we did a lot of colour tests on the wallpapers, and decided that we were going to keep the two brothers in a similar colour range. So we went from what the existing colours that were in the Shalina's restaurant interior, and then found these rather lovely wallpapers that actually worked for the other brothers' restaurant. We were very much governed by the existing signs that were there. Most of them were light boxes, with the exception of Amit's mother's restaurant. And so we had to go with the existing signs and add our own graphic, take down their signs, add our own graphic. And this was quite a number, because it was a very narrow pavement, very difficult access to some of these. But generally, with the rest of the film, the owners of most of the shops along the Golden Mile were very happy for us to use their existing signs. So we just got clearances from them and then kept them as you see them in the film. Amit is a really, really interesting director, and I really enjoy working with him. this is the second film that I've now done with Amit, and it's always very good working with, you know, particularly second, third or fourth film with the same director, in that you start to develop a shorthand that you also have then built up a degree of trust in each other in terms of your, you know, the aesthetic and what you're actually bringing to the look of the film. And Amit is, or has got a wonderfully visual imagination. Some directors find it very, very difficult to visualize anything, but I found that with Amit you can talk through ideas and then do very, very, well, sometimes very instantaneous, sometimes much more detailed sketches or models, but very much it's part of a process of actually you then develop the ideas and take them on, and it was, you know, very, very good also working with him on this, because we were creating a lot of as I say, a lot of the interiors, the two brothers' houses, for instance. There was a lot of with the props, for instance. Amit knew exactly whether something was right or wrong, and just said so absolutely immediately. And sometimes that sort of part of designing can be a very torturous process with certain directors, but with him it's very, very, very clear about exactly what he wants and doesn't want. I think that one of the most rewarding aspects of being a production designer is that you actually get to see into worlds that normally you would never get to see, and then also then have the ability or the wherewithal to actually then recreate them. And I'm always surprised in every film that I worked on that it's like coming to a kind of sealed room and opening the door and going into another complete world that you would never ever imagine, and then going through the process of, you know, just sort of dissecting it and then reassembling it as a piece of, you know, art, I suppose. It was an interesting challenge, because we had to create the idea that there was an absolute mass of people, and that the whole kind of anarchic kind of quality of Holly, we basically had to reproduce that with a very, very sort of limited number of extras. So basically we found a location which, in fact, the real Holly Festival takes place in a park in Leicester, and then we set about trying to create just a very skeletal sort of sense of colour by using a small marquee and then stringing up lots and lots of coloured fabric banners all around, and just fencing off an area so that you get the sense that this, as it does happen in reality, that it's an area of the park that is just given over to the Holly Festival. And then we set about finding loads of kind of safe kids paint, powder paint, because there was all sorts of issues about you know, health and safety issues connected with the paint, which we had to address. But it all worked out fine, and you know, it all went very well. I mean, the cookery competition was an interesting challenge, because we had a very, very limited budget, and I knew right from the word go that that I wanted to actually try and spend a bit, you know, what the limited amount of money that we had, that I wanted to reserve enough to actually make it look spectacular and classy and work as a kind of focal high point of the film, the look of the film. I also, we had the technical challenge of actually creating 5 working cooking stations that had to look suitably different from anything else that, you know, of the kind of whole MasterChef world. But at the same time work in terms of the space that we had at the People Centre, which was the stage space to use it. So I actually kind of came up with this idea of actually borrowing this Indian motif, and in fact we adapted the pattern that you see on the coloured light box for the cooking stations, based on an Indian wallpaper that we discovered. We adapted slightly and then got it printed as a translight to go on the perspex, so it's backlit perspex. And then I'd seen an interesting Oriental, Singaporean, I think it was, cooking competition on the web, where they'd actually had all the fridges in view, and I just thought it would be an added bit of colour and just make it look a bit special if we actually then hired a whole series of fridges and then dressed them with all the ingredients that we see in the film. And then the actual cooking stations, again, we had to hide the propane bottles and all the utensils and stuff underneath, so make it work. It's a kind of crucial part of the film because it's around food that the whole story hangs, resolves. I mean, every historical element of the relationship of the two brothers, the fact that they then open restaurants, and that at the very heart of the whole story is the cookery book that's been divided up between the two brothers. So the food was absolutely crucial and key element to the story. But basically what we wanted was a sense that this had been, once upon a time, had been a notebook, or it had been a file in India, you know, 40, 50 years ago. And we found some fantastic khadi papers, which are these Indian papers that there's a wonderful company that imports them. And we found that we got exactly the right kind of weight and quality of the paper, and then we printed. We found some very old 1930s ledgers that we then photocopied and then printed in colour onto the paper, but then added it in Hindi, or as if it was an old ledger from the days of the Raj bureaucracy. And then we then found some wonderful end papers, marbled end papers, and we found a wonderful binder, a local bookbinder, who then actually created, but we had to make about half a dozen of them, and he did that, and then we then collected old recipes, and we then got somebody to help us with the Hindi writing, so that there was this progression of the very early recipes all written out in Hindi in India, and then slowly, as time progresses in the book, you see the recipes then coming into English, and then from being handwritten to an earlier typewriter. So it was it was a really, really very considered piece of work. It was really, really, really nice. It's basically control. You've got much more control over the space you're working in. It just means that you don't have to find something that, very often on location, for instance, when you're looking for locations, you've got to err on the slightly larger than reality size, just for the fact that you're going to have 20 or 30 technicians working in there as well as the actors. And it also means that you got a lot more flexibility in terms of the look and style and feel. So with a set, you're creating that space right from scratch, so that everything is, or should be, exactly as you want it in terms of the space, the shape, the look, the patina. And very often it's also a lot cheaper in the long run than working on a location, because generally on a location you're going to be changing things. You then got to reinstate them, and producers always forget that actually putting back a location can cost as much, if not more, than actually building a set from scratch.